Hey nerds, happy new year. So I've been doing a lot of videos about the Wheel of Time adaptation, and you guys are expecting me to do a video about my final feelings. But before we get there, I had to make things a little bit more difficult, and I need to do a video talking about fans' relationships to adaptations in general. This is the first time I've really gotten to be at the forefront of seeing a lot of different fans' opinions on an adaptation. This is really the first year I've been in BookTube, and because of that, I was starting to see a huge pattern where it feels like we have some misconceptions about adaptations. And after I was thinking about this, I also found this incredible thesis where someone actually researched the relationship between fans and their adaptations. So today we're going to talk about misconceptions with adaptations, we're going to talk about fandoms and fans and what that means, and how the film industry has adapted because of the internet and their relationship with fans. So we'll get into that after the jump. The first misconception that I've seen a lot is that adaptations that are great do not change anything. Now, The Lord of the Rings is widely considered to be one of the best book to adaptations in our history. Most fans agree that it was a really good one, and we all hold it pretty close in our hearts. But there seems to be this misconception that Peter Jackson didn't change anything, and that's laughable. I think we've just kind of collectively forgotten how much Peter Jackson actually changed about The Lord of the Rings. The best example of this is the literal Eye of Sauron. The eye as it exists in the movie does not exist in the books, which is just wild to me because that is a huge thing to add. It is a major plot point through all three of the movies that does not exist in the books. What's so hilarious about this is that we have completely completely embraced the Eye of Sauron imagery, so much to the fact that the new anniversary editions that are beautiful that came out of Lord of the Rings feature the Eye of Sauron on the cover. It's not even in the book. Now, most fans agree that the Lord of the Rings books don't need any changing, and I'm one of those. I absolutely love the books. However, I think we can all admit that the Eye of Sauron is such an evocative imagery, and it was such a smart way to take a concept or theme from the book, which is that Sauron can see everything, and make it visual for the screen. I actually quite love it. I think there's a reason we've all embraced it because it's just iconic at this point. Now, of course, not all changes are made equal, and clearly this is an example of a change that really kept the spirit of the book and adapted it for the screen, which we'll talk about in the next misconception. But there were other changes too. There were changes to the timeline, some character shifts in order to give Arwen more screen time, and to, of course, cutting out Tom Bombadil. Now, these changes work because they still kept with the spirit of the movie, but the idea that Peter Jackson didn't change anything is simply incorrect. Another great example of this that may be lesser known because less people have read the book is The Princess Bride. Now, The Princess Bride, for people my age, is pretty much a cult classic. I grew up on that movie and loved it. I was very surprised when I read the book that the framing device used in the Princess Bride movie is wildly different than the framing device that is used in the book. They're both excellent framing devices, but they literally have nothing to do with each other. But I understand why it was changed because the framing device in the book literally impossible to work on screen. It wouldn't have happened. Yet most people agree that the Princess Bride movie is a wonderful adaptation that keeps with the spirit of the book. I mean, obviously I know because the writer wrote the screenplay, but anyway, that's besides the point. The point being, all change isn't bad change, which runs into my misconception number 2, which is that we would love a scene-by-scene recreation of our favorite books. Honestly, I know we think we'd love this, but I really don't think we would because it does not account for the vast differences between text and visual mediums. I already kind of mentioned this with The Princess Bride, but really there would be no way that the framing device in The Princess Bride would work as a visual medium. Books also allow us the innermost thoughts of characters that simply cannot be adapted into screen without voiceovers, which generally don't work very well in my opinion. They often come off as cheesy or trying too hard. So now the visual medium has to find a way to represent those inner thoughts and the character moments in a way that makes sense to people who have no background knowledge of the book. Additionally, we have to fit books that are often hundreds and hundreds to 1,000 of pages that take hours to read into a format that usually takes around 2 hours. That is going to require adaptation. I love this quote from the thesis that I mentioned earlier. Theorist Robert Stamm argues that the novelistic character is a verbal artifact, constructed quite literally out of words, while the cinematic character is an uncanny amalgam of photogene, body movement, acting style, and grain of voice, all amplified and molded by lighting, mise-en-scene, and music. While adaptation may begin with the written word, it is a combination of elements that are capable of telling the story on screen. Therefore, filmmakers of adaptations may need to consider the depictions and projections of the story through other means, but with an awareness of the specific information craved by the audience. He argues that the nature of adaptation is alteration. as changes are inevitable the moment one abandons the linguistic for the visual medium. An adaptation that immediately comes to mind when we're talking about this is The Hunger Games. Now, I personally liked the Hunger Games adaptations, particularly the first one. I thought it really captured the spirit of the book. One thing they significantly change is the end challenge in the actual games. In the books, it involves seeing the eyes of past contestants, and it is very creepy, very horror-like, very disturbing. And they didn't do that in the movie. And I remember watching it and being kind of bummed, but also completely understanding why they wouldn't do that. How would you portray that without being able to know Katniss's inner horror and hearing her inner thoughts? How would you make it work without it being so cheesy or having to have an extra long exposition to explain what was happening? It's just one good example of how things that work when you read don't always work when you adapt to screen. Again, we don't really need a recreation of scene by scene of our favorite books. We need an adaptation that evokes the same feelings, emotions, and overall sense of what that book was. And now that's not to say like, just do whatever you want. I think keeping major events in the book matter, but I just don't think it has to be scene by scene. Misconception number 3, adaptations are made for the book fans. Now, this one may be a particularly hard pill to swallow, but let's be honest, movies and TV shows are made for one reason: to make money. Okay, fine, that might be a little pessimistic of me. I am sure there are writers and directors and showrunners out there who really care about the artistry of film, and I would never deny that. But let's all say that they work for the person, they work for the companies whose bottom line is that they need to make money. And guess what? There aren't enough book fans to be the only audience for an adaptation to make adequate money to, especially in big fantasy adaptations, to repay the money they probably spent on it. So now they have to walk this line between pleasing book fans and making something acceptable and enjoyable to a wider audience, which I'm sure is a very difficult line to walk. The need for a general audience in an adaptation means that they can't rely heavily on fans' book knowledge, and they need to maybe tweak or shorten, especially in fantasy, the amount of lore they have and simplify it so that it can come across on screen. And another hard thing to talk about is just that they want to leverage book fans to be an automatic fan base while also not exactly catering to us but the wider audience. So that can also be hard when they want our money but maybe aren't doing the things that we would love. Misconception 4, fans will always feel the same about a book adaptation. Now this one is less based in research and really in my own personal feelings, so this is probably the least official one. But I just wanted to talk about how some fans expect every fan to feel the same way they do about an adaptation. And I think, in my opinion, the key difference is how close you are to the source material will greatly affect how you feel about an adaptation. If there is a book that got you through a really hard time, or you grew up with it, or it came into your life an important part, or if it's your very favorite book of all time, you are going to be more sensitive to littler changes. Because as book fans, we often can attach ourselves to a specific scene or moment that meant a lot to us, and it can mean very little in the book on the grand scale. But when those are left out of an adaptation, it can be very hard to swallow. I have been there, even when I'm like, I understand why they took it out, but it meant a lot to me. Whereas when I'm more of a casual fan of a book, the adaptation is usually a lot easier for me to swallow because I'm not as tied to those details. So I just think we need to remember that there can be a wide number of feelings about an adaptation and that they're all valid. Okay, we're gonna shift a little bit away from misconceptions and go into my second part of this video, which is exploring the changing relationships between showrunners and fans because of the internet. I mentioned earlier that I sourced a lot of our discussion from a dissertation that I found online. The dissertation is called Incorporating and Considering Fans, Fan Culture in Event Film Adaptation, and was written by Maggie Park for her PhD at Bangor University. This was such a fascinating read, and in it, Park explains the changing relationship between fans and the showrunners now that we can have direct access to them, and how direct access to fans has completely changed the way that films are marketed in terms of adaptations. Now, there were so many elements to the thesis that were amazing. It was like 300 pages, so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to talk about every piece of information. I am just going to pick out some of the most interesting ones, but I will link it below, and I highly recommend reading it if you are interested in these kind of relationships, because it really changed my view on adaptations. We're going to start very basic, which is, what is a fan? What is a fandom? So it turns out when we talk about film adaptation that there is a very specific definition for fan, and that definition is, if one is labeled as a fan, it implies a certain level of knowledge, passion, and a link to the text that a normal person does not possess. It is this difference from the norm that defines their culture as a select club where the knowledgeable and the dedicated are accepted. This thesis talks a lot about how fans and fandoms used to be considered fringe, weird, people we should mock or even fear sometimes. In the words of a researcher, fans were viewed as marginal, ridiculed in the media, shrouded with social stigma, pushed underground by legal threats, and often depicted as brainless and inarticulate. But this discussion goes on to talk about how the internet has made it much easier for fans to collect together, to talk about things and have immediate access to news about their adaptations. And that changing relationship, as well as the cultural shift and opinion of geekdom in general, has vastly changed that opinion of fans. As one researcher so eloquently put it, being a geek has entered the realm of the publicly accepted, and the fan is a sought-after commodity for multi-million-dollar films. So what does it mean now that fans are considered a commodity? Well, first we need to talk a little bit about fandoms in general. One of the parts of this thesis that I found incredibly interesting was them talking about the relationships between fans within fandoms themselves. One thing I found was very interesting that they talked about is that fans within fandoms gain status by being knowledgeable about the source material. They call it fan speak, and it is fan speak by which a fan distinguishes themselves to other fans to gain what they call fan capital. In other words, to gain street cred in the fandom. This can come in different ways, which I kind of showed previously. This can come through forums where you gain special badges that let people know how involved you are in that fandom. It may become through certain websites. I think the fandoms we're involved in, we all know the places to be considered knowledgeable or important in our fandom. However, when it comes to adaptations, this kind of credentials can also turn negative. Fans may feel like they need to point out every difference when they see a trailer, for example, to prove that they are knowledgeable about their source material. There may be a worry that if you like an adaptation or like a trailer that is not directly related to the book, that you will lose credibility because you aren't noticing the differences like other fans. Now, I realize the irony of me saying this. Don't think I don't realize the irony of that, but I really didn't do it to gain cred. Or did I? I'm telling you, this thesis is making me rethink everything. In a fandom, knowledge is the currency with which we trade. That leads us into our next section, which I've titled Convincing Fans That Showrunners Are Fans. This thesis asserts that companies now realize that convincing fans that the people working on their adaptation are also fans is an important part of the film event. Do you realize the implications of that? As stated in the thesis, Thompson argues that the fan base of The Lord of the Rings was deemed vociferous enough to cause a negative impact if they found the adaptation to be too out of spirit with Tolkien's original work. And Hunter argues the lengths director Peter Jackson went in order to satisfy fans and create a clear and faithful text, but one that would satisfy the unfamiliar audience member with no emotional investment. I agree with Hunter in particular, as he claims the necessity for Jackson to appear as a fan, and Thompson who recognizes the power that an anonymous avatar online can have over the entire fandom. The necessity for Jackson to appear as a fan. This single sentence has actually shook me. Because all of a sudden, I started to realize how many times during adaptations I have been told a showrunner is a fan. And if we want to talk about Wheel of Time, that's the most recent one. Have we not been shoved down our throats with how much Rafe is a fan? Now, this video is not to talk about whether that's true or not. I don't care right now, honestly. I don't care if it's true or not. It's the idea that that was actually a specific marketing tactic, is that we have to convince fans that our showrunner is a fan. We have to convince them that the actors are a fan. We have to convince them that is a marketing tactic. They needed to give Rafe capital within our fandom. That's like just food for thought. Like, I don't have an answer to this, but then I also was thinking of Henry Cavill. Henry? Oh gosh, I got that name wrong. I'm sorry. He plays The Witcher. Now, I'm not super invested in The Witcher. You guys know I haven't even really watched it, but I have seen a bunch of his interviews where he is fanning over a lot of fantasy novels. Now, I believe it. I'm not saying that that is fake. I don't want to say that. I think he's a huge fantasy fan. But I'm starting to wonder, like, did whoever's in charge, did the powers that be tell him that he needs to talk about that a lot? Because that would give him capital within our fandom. Did they encourage him to talk about it a lot? Because they knew that that was a tactic to get people on board. Were they trying to cash in on the currency that works through our fandoms, that knowledge is key? Is it possible that this research has made me a huge skeptic and I trust nobody? Yes. As Park put it, As I illustrate in my case study, with event film adaptations, it is not just faithfulness to the text, but also the projection of a filmmaker's efforts for fidelity, or their implied desire to be faithful, that may affect the adaptation's reception in popular culture. So this perfectly segues into our next section, which is fidelity the most important thing when it comes to an adaptation? Well, as fans, I think we tend to think so. I think fidelity is extremely important to us. What I found interesting is apparently researchers are very tired of the fidelity argument. They think it's boring. They think we need to move on from it. Obviously, as fans, we don't think we do. Something I'd rather explore in this video than that, though, is something we touched briefly on earlier, which is that what does fidelity mean when we're going from text to visual medium? Because it does take on a different meaning. Fans instead can often move fidelity to meaning protecting the original feelings of the author, becoming protective of what their intended vision was. And there was this quote that I found very interesting in relation to that. Adaptations walk an undefined line between telling the filmmaker's story and telling the original author's story. They talk a lot about this term called conceptual flapping, which is the disconnect between a viewer that has read the source material, and every time they see something on screen that differs, whether they intend to or not, something in their head automatically notices the differences. And they talk about how a filmmaker's job in an adaptation is to temper that conceptual flapping in a way that makes the movie still enjoyable for those who know the source material, but also enjoyable to general audiences. But they have to realize that that comparison is unavoidable. Whether or not fans are excited to see a film or think it's going to be good, we are always going to have that running total. It's very difficult to temper. I could honestly spend a whole video talking about fidelity, but I did think this concept was very interesting of, well, the filmmaker has something that they're interested in telling, but then they also have this problem of needing to tell the story of the author. And I think fidelity often is one of those things that's very hard to describe or pinpoint. It's more of a feeling, and it's kind of one of those things, well, like, I know it when I see it. So some conclusions. If you're new here, I got a lot of new subscribers recently. You may not know that when I do videos like this, I rarely offer a conclusion. I'm usually just trying to explore the topic and keep it open-ended and maybe ask more questions than I answer, leaving a lot of room for you guys to tell me what you think so we can continue this discussion and maybe evolve our opinions together. So I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say on these various topics that I've presented today. What I will say is that this thesis gave me a better appreciation for the artistry of the film, the director, the writer. I think as a book fan, I automatically defaulted to really being defensive of the original author's art and vision, with very little respect to the art that is directing, the art that is writing a film. And that quote about, hey, a director, a producer, they have a stamp that is on their films, and they now have to find a way to reconcile that with someone else's artistic vision in an adaptation, made me feel like I needed to be just maybe a little bit more forgiving of directors and producers and showrunners or what have you. Because we all know those directors that have very distinct art styles that you can go watch a movie and you're like, oh, that's so-and-so who made that movie, because it is an artistic expression. And so how do you blend that with someone else's artistic expression in a book? Now, this doesn't give them a get out of jail free card. They chose to adapt the book, so they have to know that they are going to give up some of their artistic integrity to make room for another. So it's not just like a free pass, but it was food for thought for me, for sure. I also can't stop thinking about this whole convincing fans that the showrunner is a fan. I think that's going to affect me a lot whenever I start seeing that in media as maybe more calculated than it was before. And it also led me to this question that I'd be interested for you guys to answer, which is, would you have to be a fan to make a good adaptation? Could there be someone who they were like, hey, we think your directing style would be great for this fantasy adaptation? They're like, oh, I haven't read the book, but I'll go read it. And then they go read the series or the book or whatever it is. So they weren't a fan originally. They'd probably have to at least like what they were adapting, but would you have to be a fan? There might be people who'd be very good at adapting things without being a fan. And so should we place so much currency on that? I don't have an answer. It's just a question I was thinking about. And additionally, when knowledge is the currencies of our fandom, how knowledgeable is the right amount of knowledgeable? It's very unlikely that our super fans that we know are going to be the showrunners. They're probably somewhere in the middle. And is that enough? It's just an interesting question. Where is it on the scale? It's also interesting just to view the changing relationships between filmmakers and fans as we have more access, and as that they are trying to leverage our capital and leverage leverage our fandom for success while also trying to appeal to the broadest person possible. So there's always going to be just some sort of tension there, in my opinion. And, how do we feel about that? Okay, these are all the questions I have. I don't have answers. Please let me know what you think below. I really had to make this video first, as I've been thinking about this before I did my final Wheel of Time retrospective, because it did really help me put into context why I was feeling the way I was about the Wheel of Time adaptation. And so I hope this background knowledge can maybe help us all examine our feelings to the Wheel of Time adaptation and how we feel about it and what it means. It doesn't necessarily make me feel more positive about it, but it does put it into context. So as always, I really want to know what you think. Please leave a comment below. If you like these kind of videos and want to see more deep dives, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading or other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.